Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Hello there, and welcome to episode 2 of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. In this particular episode, we are going to be talking about podcast hosts versus podcast directories. This is something that I get asked about an awful lot. So first of all, we're going to break down what is the difference between a podcast host and a podcast directory. Now, a podcast host is almost like it says on the tin. Your hosting platform is literally where your podcast is going to be hosted. So there are a range of them out there, and examples off the top of my head, you've got Buzzsprout, Anchor, Libsyn. Buzzsprout is the one that I use. It is my favorite, it's my one of choice, but as I said, there are a range of different ones out there. And what you will do is you will set up all of your background in your podcast host. Your podcast host is then what pushes your podcast out to the different directories. And examples of podcast directories include Apple Podcasts, include Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio. There's so many. There's the big names, but there's also more slightly obscure ones as well. But essentially, what you will be doing is you will be hosting your podcast on a hosting platform, and then you will be setting up your podcast host to connect to the podcast directories, and every time you upload a new episode to your podcast host, it will then send that information across to the directories and your new episode will appear in the directories. Now, quite often people get quite overwhelmed and they say, do I need multiple hosts? Do I need multiple directories? No, you need one host, one hosting platform for your podcast. However, you can then get on as many directories as you possibly can. And I would encourage you to get on as many directories as possible. At an absolute minimum, I advise you to get on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The reasons for that is around 40% of all podcast listeners will listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts, and it's around 20 to 30% on Spotify of all of the other podcast platforms. And then listenership for all of the other podcast directories will make up much smaller percentages. But at an absolute minimum, you want to get on Apple Podcasts and also on Spotify. However, on saying that, I would recommend getting on as many directories as you possibly can. And the reasoning for this is because even if only one person listens to you on a really obscure and minuscule podcast directory, they could be the one person that ends up being your raving fan and tells everybody about your podcast, and they completely fall through your marketing funnel and they buy every single one of your services and every single one of your products. So as I said, absolute minimum, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but try and get on as many as possible. Now, when you set up with your podcast host will give you directions as to how to submit your RSS feed to the different directories. And you think of your RSS feed as almost like a little communication code or a little communication snippet, as it were, because what your RSS feed does is every time you put a new episode on your host, the RSS feed literally feeds that information across to the directory and your episode will appear on the podcast directory. And then anytime you make any changes to that episode, that also gets updated there. So to put yourself on those different directories, you don't just go straight to Apple Podcasts, you don't just go straight to Spotify or to Stitcher or whoever. You get registered with a hosting platform. As I said, my one of choice is Buzzsprout, and if you want a link for that, it is down in the show notes. And then you use your host to then push your podcast out to the different podcast directories. So I hope that in this episode, this has been really useful for you to identify what the difference is between podcast hosting and podcast directories is, and it's also given you some ideas as to which directories you want to get on as a priority. And as I said, that's Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks so much for tuning in for this episode, and I will see you in episode 3.